building up the courage she'd been gathering for weeks. This was supposed to be her moment of quiet rebellion, a secret meeting with Sarah Mitchell about divorce options, while her CEO husband attended his board meeting across town. But Jonathan Pierce had found her anyway. The tracking app on her phone. She'd forgotten about the tracking app. "I don't understand why you're so upset," Rebecca said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady even as his grip tightened. "I just wanted some fresh air. The baby's been kicking all morning, and I thought—" "Don't lie to me," Jonathan hissed, sliding into the booth across from her with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to getting his way in boardrooms and bedrooms alike. At 34, he commanded a tech empire worth $50 million and had the kind of confident presence that made investors write checks and employees work overtime without complaint. But right now, his carefully cultivated image was cracking at the edges. "I can see your location, Rebecca. You've been sitting in this place for over an hour. Who are you meeting?" Rebecca's hand instinctively moved to her belly, protecting the life growing inside her. The baby girl seemed to sense her mother's distress, kicking harder against Rebecca's ribs. At 29, Rebecca had once been confident enough to run marketing campaigns for mid-sized companies, but 2 years of marriage to Jonathan had slowly eroded her sense of self until she barely recognized the woman she'd become. "No one," she whispered. "I'm not meeting anyone." "Then why?" Jonathan's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper she'd learned to fear. "Did you turn off your phone for 37 minutes between 2:15 and 2:52? The diner around them buzzed with typical afternoon activity. A businessman in the corner booth typed furiously on his laptop while nursing cold coffee. 2 elderly women near the window shared a piece of apple pie and decades of friendship. A young mother tried to convince her toddler that grilled cheese was more interesting than the toy cars he'd lined up on the table. Normal people living normal lives, Rebecca thought. When had her life stopped being normal? "I told you," Rebecca said, her voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. "The battery died. I forgot my charger." Jonathan's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Right. Just like you forgot to mention that you've been researching divorce lawyers online. Did you think I wouldn't notice the browser history, Rebecca? Did you think I'm stupid?" The color drained from Rebecca's face. She'd used private browsing. She'd been so careful. But Jonathan had ways of monitoring everything. Their home network, her devices, even her credit card statements that showed every purchase down to the penny. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but they both knew she was lying. "Get up," Jonathan commanded, his voice returning to its normal volume, but losing none of its menace. "We're going home. Now." "I haven't finished my—" "Get up, Rebecca." She looked down at her untouched sandwich and cold tea. Her hands shook as she reached for her purse, a designer bag that Jonathan had chosen for her birthday. Everything in her life carefully curated by his preferences, his image of who she should be. "I'm not ready to leave," she said, the words surprising her with their firmness. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. In the corporate world, people jumped when he spoke. At home, Rebecca had learned to anticipate his moods, to smooth over his irritations, to make herself smaller so he could feel larger. But today, something was different. Maybe it was the baby who seemed to be giving her courage with every kick. Maybe it was the months of planning that had led to this moment. Or maybe she was just tired of being afraid in her own life. "What did you say?" Jonathan's voice carried that edge that made board members reconsider their positions and employees work weekends without overtime pay. "I said I'm not ready to leave." Rebecca's voice was stronger now, though her hands still trembled. "I'm having lunch, like a normal person." "You are not a normal person," Jonathan snapped, his carefully maintained public facade beginning to crack. "You are my wife. You are carrying my child, and you will get in that car right now and come home where you belong." "Where I belong?" The words escaped before Rebecca could stop them, carrying years of suppressed frustration. "I belong wherever I choose to be, Jonathan. I'm a grown woman, not your property." The businessman in the corner looked up from his laptop. The elderly women stopped talking about their grandchildren. The young mother paused in her negotiations with her toddler. The normal sounds of the diner seemed to quiet as Jonathan's face flushed red with anger. "Don't you dare," he said through gritted teeth, reaching across the table to grab her wrist. His fingers wrapped around her arm with painful pressure, and Rebecca gasped. "Don't you dare embarrass me in public like this. Do you have any idea how this looks? The CEO of Pierce Technologies having to drag his pregnant wife out of some roadside diner like a common... Let go of me." Rebecca tried to pull her arm back, but Jonathan's grip tightened. She could feel his fingers digging into her skin, could see the white marks forming where he held her. "Jonathan, you're hurting me. I'll do more than hurt you if you don't get up right now," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled rage that Rebecca had learned to recognize as the most dangerous kind. "You've embarrassed me enough today. Get up, get in the car, and we'll discuss your little adventure when we get home." The threat hung in the air between them, loaded with 2 years of marriage that had slowly transformed from fairy tale to nightmare. Rebecca had married the charming, successful businessman who'd swept her off her feet with expensive dinners and weekend getaways. She'd moved into his world of country clubs and charity galas, leaving behind her own friends and family to become the perfect CEO wife. But perfection, she'd learned, was a moving target that she could never quite hit. "Please," she whispered, her free hand still protectively covering her belly. "You're scaring the baby. She's kicking so hard." "The baby is fine," Jonathan said coldly. "You're the one causing problems. You're the one sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, researching ways to destroy our family." "What kind of mother does that, Rebecca?" The words hit like physical blows. Jonathan had perfected the art of making her feel guilty for his behavior, of twisting every situation until she was the one apologizing, the one in the wrong. But today, with his fingers bruising her wrist and his voice carrying threats, something inside Rebecca refused to bend. "The kind of mother who wants her daughter to grow up knowing she has choices," Rebecca said quietly. Jonathan's grip tightened until Rebecca cried out in pain. The businessman dropped his laptop screen shut. The elderly women had stopped pretending not to watch. Even the toddler with his toy cars had fallen silent, sensing the adult tension crackling through the air. And that's when the kitchen door swung open. The cook who emerged was tall and lean, with close-cropped hair and the kind of alert posture that suggested military training. He wore a simple white apron over jeans and a t-shirt, but something in his bearing commanded immediate attention. His eyes swept the diner with practiced efficiency, taking in the scene at Rebecca's booth with the kind of tactical assessment that missed nothing. Rebecca looked up at him, and her world shifted on its axis. "Mac?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh my God, Marcus." Colonel Marcus Thompson, her older brother who she hadn't seen in 2 years thanks to Jonathan's systematic isolation tactics, stood 3 feet away wearing a cook's apron and an expression that could have frozen hell itself. He took one look at Jonathan's hand wrapped around his pregnant sister's wrist, at the fear in Rebecca's eyes, at the tears she was trying so hard not to shed, and stepped forward with the quiet precision of a man trained to neutralize threats. "Afternoon, folks," Max said calmly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from leading soldiers through combat zones. "Everything all right over here?" Jonathan looked up at the interruption, his face flushed with irritation at being disturbed in what he clearly considered a private family matter. His grip on Rebecca's wrist didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened possessively as he sized up the man who dared to interfere. "Everything's fine," Jonathan said with the dismissive tone he typically used for service workers and subordinates. "Just a small disagreement between husband and wife. Nothing that concerns the kitchen staff." Mac's eyes never left Jonathan's face, but Rebecca could see him cataloging every detail with military precision. The bruising grip on her wrist, the defensive way she cradled her pregnant belly, the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide. 2 years of deployment in active combat zones had taught him to assess threats quickly and respond accordingly. "Rebecca?" Mac asked quietly, his voice gentle despite the steel underneath. "You okay, sis?" The endearment hit Jonathan like a physical blow. His carefully maintained image of control cracked as he realized this wasn't just some random diner employee who could be intimidated or dismissed. This was family. This was the brother Rebecca had talked about incessantly during their early dating days, the decorated Air Force colonel who'd been deployed overseas for most of their marriage. "You're Rebecca's brother," Jonathan said, his voice carrying a different quality now, calculating rather than dismissive. The military one. Colonel Marcus Thompson, Mac replied evenly, and you must be Jonathan. The two men studied each other across the booth, and Rebecca felt the tension in the air shift from domestic dispute to something far more dangerous. Jonathan might have $50 million in a corporate empire, but Mac had spent 15 years learning how to neutralize threats and protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Well, Colonel, Jonathan said with forced congeniality, though his grip on Rebecca's wrist remained painful. This is certainly a surprise. Rebecca didn't mention you were working here. Lot of things Rebecca probably hasn't mentioned, Mac replied quietly. Been a while since we had a proper conversation. Rebecca caught the subtle accusation in his tone and felt a flush of shame. Jonathan had masterfully isolated her from her family over the past 2 years, making her feel guilty for every phone call, every text message, every attempt at maintaining relationships outside their marriage. Gradually, she'd stopped reaching out rather than face the arguments and accusations that followed. Yes, well, Jonathan said, trying to regain control of the situation. Rebecca gets very busy with her responsibilities as my wife. Corporate life is demanding, and she has the baby to think about now. Seems like she's thinking about the baby just fine, Mac observed, noting how protectively Rebecca held her belly. Question is, why does she look scared of you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dorothy Henderson, the diner's owner, had emerged from behind the counter and stood watching the scene with the kind of protective alertness that came from 40 years of serving coffee to truckers, businessmen, and the occasional domestic dispute that spilled into her establishment. She's not scared, Jonathan said quickly, but his defensive tone suggested otherwise. She's just emotional. Pregnancy hormones, you understand, makes women unpredictable. Mac's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Let go of her wrist. Excuse me? You heard me. Mac's voice remained calm, but the authority underneath was unmistakable. Take your hand off my sister. Jonathan's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Being challenged by a diner cook in front of an audience was exactly the kind of public humiliation that his ego couldn't tolerate. But this wasn't just any diner cook. This was a decorated military officer who clearly wasn't impressed by Jonathan's wealth or position. I don't think you understand who you're talking to, Jonathan said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled rage that had made corporate rivals back down and employees work overtime without complaint. I'm the CEO of Pierce Technologies. I'm worth more than everyone in this diner combined. And this is my wife we're discussing. Don't care if you're worth $1 billion, Mac replied evenly. Don't care if you own the whole state. What I care about is that you're hurting my sister, and I'm asking you nicely to stop. Asking nicely? Jonathan laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think you can intimidate me? Some pathetic military washout working as a short-order cook? Do you have any idea what kind of lawyers I can afford? What kind of trouble I can make for you? Mac took one step closer to the booth, close enough that his presence became impossible to ignore. At 35, he was lean and fit in the way that came from years of military discipline, and while he wasn't particularly tall or imposing, there was something in his bearing that suggested crossing him would be a serious mistake. You're right, Mac said quietly. I don't know what kind of lawyers you can afford, but I know what happens when someone hurts my family, and I know that your money won't help you if you don't let go of her wrist right now. Rebecca had never heard her brother use that tone before, calm and conversational on the surface, but carrying the kind of quiet certainty that came from years of making life and death decisions in combat zones. Jonathan must have heard it too, because his grip on her wrist finally loosened slightly. This is ridiculous, Jonathan said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Rebecca, tell your brother that everything's fine. Tell him we're just having a conversation. Rebecca looked up at Mac, seeing him clearly for the first time in 2 years. He'd lost weight since his last deployment, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of experiences she couldn't imagine. But his expression as he looked at her was exactly the same as when they were children, and he'd positioned himself between her and the neighborhood bullies who thought picking on a younger girl was acceptable entertainment. It's not fine, she said quietly, the words carrying 2 years of suppressed truth. Nothing's been fine for a long time. Jonathan's face went white with shock and fury. In their private arguments, Rebecca always eventually backed down, always apologized, always found ways to make his behavior her fault. But here, in front of witnesses and her brother's protective presence, she was refusing to play the role he'd trained her to perform. "Rebecca," he said through gritted teeth, his grip tightening again until she gasped in pain. "Think very carefully about what you're saying. Think about what you're risking." Mac moved so quickly that Jonathan didn't have time to react. One moment he was threatening Rebecca with his words and his grip, and the next he was doubled over in the booth, his hand releasing her wrist as Mac applied pressure to a nerve point in his shoulder with surgical precision. "I asked nicely," Mac said conversationally, maintaining the pressure until Jonathan's face went pale with pain. "Now I'm going to ask once more, and this time I suggest you listen. Take your hands off my sister, apologize for hurting her, and then we can all have a civil conversation about what happens next." The diner had gone completely silent. Even the coffee machine seemed to have stopped gurgling. Dorothy Henderson had her phone in her hand, finger poised over 911, while the other diners watched with the kind of fascinated horror that came from witnessing a real-life confrontation. Jonathan tried to pull away from Mac's grip, but the pressure point technique was precisely applied, enough to cause significant discomfort without leaving visible marks or causing permanent damage. It was the kind of skill that came from military training in controlling hostile situations without escalating to lethal force. "Let go of me," Jonathan gasped, his earlier arrogance replaced by shocked pain. "I'll have you arrested for assault." "Will you?" Mac asked mildly, not releasing the pressure. "You want to explain to the police why you were bruising a pregnant woman's wrist? Want to discuss that with the local news when they pick up the story about the CEO who got into a public fight with a military veteran?" Jonathan's eyes darted around the diner, taking in all the witnesses who had clearly seen him grab Rebecca, heard him threaten her, watched the entire confrontation unfold. His carefully maintained public image was cracking, and he knew it. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth as Mac finally released the pressure point. "You have no idea what you started here." "Actually," Mac said calmly, "I think it's been going on for a while. I'm just ending it." Jonathan stood up from the booth, his shoulder still aching from Mac's precise application of pressure. His face was flushed with rage and humiliation, but he was smart enough to recognize that he'd lost this particular battle. The question was whether he'd be smart enough to walk away or foolish enough to escalate. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that she'd learned to fear more than his explosive anger. "You're making a mistake, a very big mistake, and mistakes have consequences." With that threat hanging in the air, Jonathan Pierce turned and walked out of Henderson's diner, leaving behind his pregnant wife, her military brother, and a room full of witnesses who had just seen the careful facade of his perfect marriage crumble in real time. Rebecca looked down at her wrist, already seeing the finger-shaped bruises forming on her pale skin, and realized that after 2 years of careful isolation and systematic control, she was finally not alone anymore. The silence that followed Jonathan's dramatic exit lasted approximately 10 seconds before the diner erupted in a buzz of concerned voices and scraping chairs. Dorothy Henderson was the first to move, appearing at Rebecca's booth with a clean dish towel wrapped around ice from the drink station. "For your wrist, honey," Dot said gently, her voice carrying the kind of maternal authority that came from 40 years of taking care of people who wandered into her establishment seeking more than just food. "Mac, get her some water and maybe some of that chamomile tea from the back." Mac slid into the booth across from his sister, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes showing the kind of fury that came from seeing someone he loved being hurt. At 35, he'd learned to manage his anger in combat zones, but domestic violence against his pregnant sister pushed him dangerously close to his limits. "How long?" he asked quietly, nodding toward Rebecca's bruised wrist. "How long has this been going on?" Rebecca pressed the ice-wrapped towel against her wrist, wincing at the cold but grateful for the numbing relief. The bruises were already darkening, 5 perfect finger-shaped marks that told their own story. She'd gotten good at hiding bruises over the past year. Makeup could cover a lot, and long sleeves were fashionable even in summer. "It's not usually physical," she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. "Mostly it's just control. He needs to know where I am, who I'm talking to, what I'm spending money on, the tracking app on my phone, cameras in the house, monitoring my credit cards. He says it's because he loves me, because he wants to protect me. Mac's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. And the physical part? Rebecca touched her belly protectively. Started about 3 months ago when I began showing. Nothing major, just grabbing my arm when he was angry, pushing me away when I tried to hug him. Today was the first time she gestured to her wrist, unable to finish the sentence. Jesus, Becca. Mac ran a hand through his close-cropped hair, and Rebecca could see him struggling to process what she was telling him. Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you reach out? The question carried no judgment, only pain, but Rebecca felt the familiar weight of shame anyway. How could she explain that Jonathan had slowly, systematically convinced her that her family didn't really care about her, that Mac was too busy with his military career to be bothered with her problems, that reaching out would only prove what Jonathan always said, that she was weak, needy, incapable of handling her own life? He moved us away from everyone, Rebecca said finally. Said it was for his career, but really it was to isolate me. Then he started monitoring everything, my phone, my email, even my internet browsing. If I called you or mom and dad, he'd want to know what we talked about, why I needed to bother you with my problems. He made it seem like I was being selfish for wanting to maintain relationships outside our marriage. Mac's expression grew darker with each revelation, but he kept his voice calm and steady. Combat experience had taught him that survivors needed to feel safe before they could share the full truth, and he could see that Rebecca was still scared, not just of Jonathan, but of the consequences of finally speaking up. You're not selfish, he said firmly, and you're not bothering anyone by needing your family. That's what family is for. Dorothy returned with the chamomile tea and pulled a chair up to their booth, settling her solid frame with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested she had something important to say. I've been watching that man for the past 20 minutes, Dot announced without preamble. Been running this place for 38 years, and I've learned to recognize trouble when I see it. That husband of yours, he's trouble with a capital T. Rebecca looked up, surprised by the older woman's blunt assessment. You were watching us? Honey, I was watching the parking lot, Dot corrected. That man sat in his fancy car for nearly 20 minutes before he came in here. 20 minutes of just sitting and staring at this building like he was planning something. That's not the behavior of someone who just happened to find his wife at a diner. Mac leaned forward, his military training automatically focusing on tactical details. He was surveilling the location before moving in. That's exactly what he was doing, Dot confirmed. And another thing, I've got security cameras covering every angle of this place, including audio recording for the past 2 years, since that incident with the drunk truckers. Every word of that conversation is documented, including the threats and the part where he grabbed you. Rebecca's teacup rattled against the saucer as her hands began to shake. You recorded everything? Everything, Dot said firmly. And before you start worrying about privacy or consent, this is my establishment and I have signs posted about security monitoring. That recording is completely legal, and it clearly shows a pattern of threatening behavior culminating in physical assault. Mac exchanged a meaningful look with Dorothy. In his experience, domestic abusers relied on isolation and the absence of witnesses to maintain control over their victims. Having independent documentation of Jonathan's behavior would be crucial if Rebecca decided to take legal action. There's something else, Dot continued, pulling her phone from her apron pocket. I started recording on this the minute I heard him raise his voice. Old habit from dealing with difficult customers. Sometimes you need proof of what really happened. She showed them the phone's recording app, displaying a file that was nearly 15 minutes long. The timestamp showed it had started just after Jonathan's voice had cut through the diner like a blade, demanding that Rebecca get in the car. You recorded the whole thing? Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Including the part where he threatened you with consequences for embarrassing him, Dot confirmed. Also got the physical assault on camera and audio. That man just handed us everything we'd need to get you a restraining order and press criminal charges if you want to pursue that option. Rebecca stared at the phone, processing the implications. For 2 years, Jonathan's abuse had happened in private, behind closed doors where there were no witnesses and no proof. It had been his word against hers, and his word carried the weight of $50 million and a flawless public reputation. But now there was evidence. Independent, objective proof of his threats and violence. "I don't know if I can," Rebecca said quietly, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. "He has so much money, so many lawyers. He could destroy me in court. And the baby, what if he tries to take the baby?" Mac reached across the table and covered her free hand with his. His palm was warm and calloused from years of military service, but his touch was gentle and reassuring. "Becca, listen to me," he said seriously. "I know you're scared. I know this feels overwhelming, but you don't have to face this alone anymore. I'm here, Dot's here, and we're not going anywhere." "But your deployment," Rebecca started. "Is over," Mac interrupted. "I've been back stateside for 6 months, working here while I figure out what comes next. PTSD doesn't exactly make for smooth transitions back to civilian life, but helping people seems to be good therapy for me." Rebecca looked at her brother with new understanding. She'd been so focused on her own isolation that she hadn't considered that Mac might be dealing with his own struggles after returning from combat deployment. The idea that he'd been working at the diner as part of his own healing process, only to find himself protecting her in a moment of crisis, felt like more than coincidence. "Why didn't you tell me you were back?" she asked. Mac's expression tightened with something that might have been guilt. "I tried calling a few times, but you never answered. When I finally got through, you said you were busy with Jonathan's social calendar and couldn't talk. I figured you'd call when you had time." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She remembered those calls, remembered Jonathan's irritation whenever her phone rang, remembered the arguments that followed if she spent too much time talking to anyone outside their immediate social circle. Gradually, it had become easier to let calls go to voicemail, to text brief responses instead of having conversations. He made it difficult, she admitted. Every call, every text, every email had to be justified. Who was I talking to? What did they want? Why couldn't I handle things myself instead of bothering other people? After a while, it was just easier to not. "That's how abusers work," Dot said matter-of-factly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen this pattern before. "They isolate you gradually, make you feel guilty for maintaining normal relationships, convince you that depending on anyone else is a weakness. Before you know it, you're trapped in a world where they're your only source of information about what's normal and what's not." Rebecca's phone buzzed against the table, making all three of them jump. The screen displayed Jonathan's name and a text message preview that made Mac's expression turn dangerous. "You'll regret embarrassing me like that," the message read. "Both of you." A second message followed immediately. "This is far from over, Rebecca. You have no idea what you've started." Mac read the messages over Rebecca's shoulder, his calm facade finally cracking to reveal the fury underneath. "He's threatening you. He's threatening both of us." "That's what he does," Rebecca said quietly, her voice carrying 2 years of exhausted defeat. "He makes threats. Then when I get scared, he tells me I'm overreacting, that he didn't mean it the way it sounded, that I'm too emotional to understand what he really meant." "Gaslighting," Dot said grimly, "making you question your own perception of reality. It's psychological abuse, honey, and it's just as damaging as the physical kind." Max stood up from the booth with sudden decision, his military bearing returning in full force. "Becca, I need you to listen to me carefully. I'm not going back to base as planned. I'm staying here. I'm staying close. And I'm making sure you and that baby are safe." "Mac, you can't." "I can, and I will," he interrupted with the kind of quiet authority that had commanded respect in combat zones. "I let you disappear from my life once because I didn't understand what was happening. I won't make that mistake again." Rebecca looked at her brother, seeing him clearly for the first time in years, the lean frame that spoke of too many MREs and too much stress, the alert posture that never quite relaxed, even in civilian settings, the protective fury in his eyes that transformed him from her big brother into the decorated military officer who'd spent years learning how to neutralize threats and protect innocent people. "What are we going to do?" she asked quietly. Mac's smile was grim but determined. "We're going to document everything, gather evidence, and make sure Jonathan Pierce learns that there are some people his money can't intimidate. Outside in the parking lot, Jonathan's Mercedes sat idling under the afternoon sun, its occupant making phone calls with the kind of animated gestures that suggested he was marshaling his considerable resources for war. But inside Henderson's diner, Rebecca Thompson Pierce was no longer alone, no longer isolated, and no longer willing to be afraid of the man who'd spent 2 years convincing her that she was powerless. The battle was about to begin, and for the first time in months, Rebecca felt like she might actually have a chance of winning. Sarah Mitchell arrived at Henderson's diner 45 minutes after Rebecca's text, her usually immaculate lawyer's composure slightly disheveled from the emergency drive across town. At 42, Sarah commanded respect in family courts with her sharp wit and thorough preparation, but the scene that greeted her in the diner booth stopped her cold. Rebecca sat wrapped in a borrowed sweater from Dot's Lost and Found, her bruised wrist elevated on a stack of napkins, while her brother maintained a protective position that screamed military training. The contrast between the successful CEO wife Sarah remembered from law school alumni events and the frightened woman before her was stark and heartbreaking. "Jesus, Becca," Sarah breathed, sliding into the booth next to her former classmate. "When you texted that you needed help, I thought you meant divorce paperwork. I didn't realize—" "It escalated quickly," Rebecca said quietly, unconsciously cradling her pregnant belly. "I don't think I fully understood how bad things had gotten until today." Sarah's trained eye cataloged the evidence. The finger-shaped bruises on Rebecca's wrist, the defensive posture, the way Rebecca flinched slightly when Sarah moved too quickly. As a family lawyer specializing in domestic relations, she'd seen this pattern countless times, but it was different when the victim was someone she'd known since law school. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, pulling out her legal pad and a digital recorder. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out. Even details that seem minor could be important later." Mac listened silently as Rebecca recounted 2 years of systematic isolation and control, occasionally asking clarifying questions with the precision of someone trained to gather intelligence. Sarah took notes steadily, her expression growing darker with each revelation about Jonathan's methods of manipulation and surveillance. "The financial control is particularly concerning," Sarah said when Rebecca finished her account. "Freezing access to joint accounts, monitoring every purchase, requiring permission for basic expenses. That's economic abuse, and it's a recognized form of domestic violence in this state." "Adrahanam. But he always said it was because he loved me," Rebecca said, the words carrying the exhausted confusion of someone whose reality had been systematically distorted. "That he wanted to take care of me so I wouldn't have to worry about money or decisions. That managing finances was too stressful for someone in my condition." "That's manipulation," Sarah said firmly. "Love doesn't involve controlling someone's access to basic necessities or monitoring their every movement. What you're describing is a textbook case of coercive control." Mac's phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. He glanced at Rebecca before answering, his voice cautious but professional. "Colonel Thompson." The voice on the other end was crisp and efficient, belonging to someone accustomed to military protocol. "Colonel, this is Emma Thompson, your wife. I've been trying to reach you for the past hour." Mac's expression softened slightly. "Emma, I'm sorry. I'm dealing with a family emergency. Rebecca's in trouble with that husband of hers," Emma interrupted. "Yes, I figured that out when you didn't come home and didn't answer your phone." "Where are you?" "Henderson's Diner on Route 9. "Emma, it's complicated." "I'm 20 minutes away," Emma said without hesitation. "And Mac? I'm bringing the emergency kit." Mac ended the call and looked at Rebecca with something approaching optimism for the first time since the confrontation began. "Emma's coming. She's a licensed counselor who specializes in military family services, and she's been worried about you for months based on the things I've told her about your situation." "You talked to your wife about me?" Rebecca asked, uncertain whether to feel grateful or embarrassed. "I talked to my wife about my sister, who disappeared from my life, and whose husband seemed to discourage any contact with her family," Mac clarified. "Emma has a lot of experience with domestic situations, both in military families and civilian cases. She might be able to help us understand our options." Sarah looked up from her notes. "Actually, that's perfect. I was going to suggest that we put together a support team. Rebecca, I need to be honest with you about what we're facing legally." Rebecca's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. "How bad is it?" Jonathan has significant financial resources and will likely hire the best lawyers money can buy, Sarah said without sugarcoating the reality. He'll try to portray you as an unstable wife who's been influenced by outside forces to make false accusations. The fact that your brother is military might actually work against us initially. He could claim that Mac's combat experience makes him violent and that he's a bad influence. Mac's jaw tightened. So we're fighting an uphill battle from the start. Not necessarily, Sarah said, her voice taking on the confident tone that had made her successful in family court. We have several advantages that Jonathan might not expect. First, we have independent documentation of his threats and physical assault thanks to Dot's recordings. Second, we have witnesses to his behavior. Third, and this is important, I know Jonathan from law school. Rebecca looked up with interest. You know him? We were study partners for constitutional law, Sarah said, her expression grim. Even then, he had control issues. He had to be in charge of every group project, had to have the final say on every decision. I watched him systematically undermine a brilliant classmate named Jennifer Walsh because she challenged his interpretation of a case. What happened to Jennifer? Mac asked. She transferred to another law school after Jonathan spread rumors about her mental stability and academic integrity. Looking back now with professional experience, I can see the pattern. Jonathan has always been someone who needs to win, even if it means destroying other people. Dorothy returned to their table with fresh coffee and the kind of determined expression that suggested she had something important to contribute. I've been thinking about this situation, she announced, settling her solid frame in the remaining chair. And I think you folks might be underestimating what you're dealing with here. What do you mean? Rebecca asked. I mean that man has been planning this confrontation for longer than you might think, Dot said seriously. 20 minutes of surveillance before coming in here suggests he was gathering intelligence, assessing the situation. That's not the behavior of someone acting on impulse. Mac nodded grimly. She's right. In my experience, that level of pre-planning suggests he's been preparing for the possibility that Rebecca might try to leave or seek help, which means he probably has countermeasures ready. Countermeasures? Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand reassuringly. It means we need to assume he's going to fight dirty, but it also means we need to be smarter and more prepared than he expects us to be. Emma Thompson arrived 15 minutes later, looking every inch the capable military spouse who'd learned to handle crises with efficiency and grace. At 32, she had the kind of practical competence that came from managing family emergencies while her husband was deployed, and she immediately took charge of the situation with the kind of quiet authority that complemented Mac's protective instincts. Rebecca, Emma said warmly, sliding into the booth next to her sister-in-law. I'm so glad you're safe. Mac has been worried about you for months. Rebecca found herself unexpectedly emotional at Emma's genuine concern. Jonathan had convinced her that Mac's wife probably resented her for taking up her husband's attention, but Emma's presence felt nothing but supportive and protective. I'm sorry, Rebecca said, her voice thick with tears she'd been holding back all afternoon. I'm sorry I disappeared from your lives. I'm sorry I didn't call when things got bad. I'm sorry. Stop, Emma said firmly but kindly. You have nothing to apologize for. Isolation is one of the primary tools abusers use to maintain control. The fact that you're here now, that you're ready to fight back, that takes incredible courage. Sarah looked up from her legal pad. Emma, what's your professional assessment of Rebecca's situation? Emma's expression grew serious as she studied Rebecca's posture, the protective way she held her belly, the bruises on her wrist. Classic pattern of coercive control escalating to physical violence. The pregnancy is likely a trigger factor. Many abusers escalate during pregnancy because they see it as ultimate proof of their control over their victim. So what do we do? Mac asked. Emma opened the bag she'd brought and pulled out a thick folder. We document everything, we build a case, and we make sure Rebecca and the baby are safe while we do it. I brought emergency housing information, legal resource contacts, and documentation templates for domestic violence cases. Rebecca stared at the folder, overwhelmed by the reality of what they were proposing. This is really happening, isn't it? I'm really going to leave him. Only if that's what you want, Sarah said gently. But Rebecca, I need you to understand something. After today's incident, After the threats and the physical assault, this situation is likely to escalate whether you leave or stay. The question is whether you want to face that escalation with support and legal protection or alone and vulnerable. Before Rebecca could answer, her phone buzzed with another message from Jonathan. This one was different from the threatening text. It was calculated and manipulative, designed to make her feel guilty and afraid. "I'm sorry for losing my temper today," the message read. "I was worried about you and the baby. Can we please talk? I love you and I want to work this out. Don't let other people destroy our marriage." Mac read the message over her shoulder and made a sound of disgust. Textbook abuser response: apologize, minimize the violence, blame outside influences, and make promises about change. The next message will probably threaten consequences if she doesn't respond, Emma added. It's a predictable cycle: violence, remorse, honeymoon period, then escalating tension leading back to violence. Rebecca's phone buzzed again, proving Emma's prediction correct. "If you don't come home tonight, I'll have to assume you're not acting in the baby's best interests. I have lawyers who can help me protect our child from this situation." The threat was clear: comply or face a custody battle. Sarah read the message and made notes in her legal pad. "He's establishing a paper trail to support claims that you're an unfit mother." These texts could actually help our case by showing his pattern of threats and manipulation. "But what if he's right?" Rebecca asked quietly. "What if I am being selfish? What if leaving is bad for the baby?" The question hung in the air, loaded with 2 years of systematic psychological manipulation designed to make Rebecca doubt her own judgment and instincts. Emma leaned forward and spoke with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of counseling military families in crisis. "Rebecca, answer me honestly. When you think about your daughter growing up, do you want her to believe that love looks like being controlled, monitored, threatened, and hurt?" Rebecca's hand moved instinctively to her belly, protecting the life growing inside her. "No, never." "Then you have your answer," Emma said simply. "Breaking the cycle of abuse isn't selfish. It's the most important thing you can do for your daughter." Max stood up from the booth with sudden decision. "Becca, I want you to stay with Emma and me tonight. We have a spare room, and our base housing has security that even Jonathan's money can't circumvent." "Mac, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Mac interrupted with the kind of quiet authority that had commanded respect in combat zones. "I'm telling you, you're my sister, you're in danger, and you're coming home with us where you'll be safe." Rebecca looked around the table at these people who'd materialized out of nowhere to offer protection and support. Sarah, the successful lawyer who was willing to take on a powerful adversary. Dorothy, the diner owner who documented everything and was ready to testify. Mac, the decorated colonel who'd positioned himself between her and danger. Emma, the counselor who understood the psychology of abuse and was offering practical help. For the first time in 2 years, Rebecca wasn't alone. "Okay," she said quietly, the word carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything. "Okay, I'll come with you." Outside in the parking lot, Jonathan's Mercedes had been replaced by a black SUV with tinted windows. The message was clear: he was escalating his surveillance and preparing for a prolonged conflict. But inside Henderson's diner, Rebecca Thompson Pierce was surrounded by people who understood that some battles were worth fighting, and that family meant showing up when someone needed you most, regardless of the cost or consequences. The war was about to begin in earnest, but for the first time since her marriage began, Rebecca felt like she might actually have a chance of winning. Jonathan's retaliation began at 6:47 the next morning, when Rebecca discovered that her debit card had been canceled and her access to their joint checking account had been frozen. She stood in the base commissary holding a cart full of basic necessities for her extended stay with Mac and Emma. Her card declined repeatedly while other military families waited patiently in line behind her. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said quietly to the cashier, her face burning with embarrassment as she pulled items from her cart. "I don't understand what's wrong with my card." Mac appeared at her elbow, having been alerted by Emma, who was monitoring the situation from their kitchen table, where she'd set up a command center of legal documents and resource information. He pulled out his own wallet without comment and paid for Rebecca's groceries, but his expression was grim with understanding. This was exactly the kind of financial warfare that domestic abusers use to maintain control. $67.34, Max said quietly as they loaded groceries into his truck. That's how much it cost him to send you a message about your complete financial dependence on his goodwill. Rebecca's phone had been buzzing continuously since dawn, with a carefully orchestrated campaign of manipulation and intimidation. The first messages were apologetic and pleading, designed to make her feel guilty for leaving. When those didn't generate a response, they became increasingly threatening, focusing on her financial vulnerability and the legal consequences of her actions. You have no money, no job, no way to support yourself or the baby, one message read. Come home and we can work this out like adults. The next message was more explicit. My lawyers tell me that abandoning the marital home while pregnant could be seen as evidence of mental instability. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sarah Mitchell called during breakfast to report that Jonathan's legal team had moved with impressive speed to establish their narrative. They'd filed emergency petitions claiming that Rebecca had been kidnapped or coerced by her military brother, and they were seeking immediate court orders to compel her return to the marital home for her own safety and that of the unborn child. It's complete bullshit, Sarah said bluntly during the conference call she'd set up with Mac and Emma present. But it's strategically smart bullshit. Jonathan's positioning himself as the concerned husband, trying to protect his mentally unstable wife from dangerous outside influences. How dangerous is this legally? Mac asked, his military experience automatically assessing threat levels and potential countermeasures. In the short term, not very, Sarah replied. We have documentation of his threats and assault, plus witness testimony. But in the long term, he's building a case that could be problematic in custody proceedings. We need to counter his narrative with evidence of our own. Emma looked up from her laptop where she'd been researching domestic violence resources and legal precedents. I've been in contact with 3 other women who've had relationships with Jonathan Pierce over the past 10 years. 2 of them are willing to provide testimony about his pattern of controlling behavior. Rebecca's heart stopped. Other women? A college girlfriend who broke up with him after he started monitoring her phone calls and following her to classes. A business associate who dated him briefly and ended the relationship when he began showing up at her workplace, unannounced and questioning her colleagues about her activities. Both described the same pattern. Initial charm followed by systematic attempts to control and isolate. The revelation that Jonathan's abusive behavior predated their marriage hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She'd spent 2 years believing that somehow she was the problem, that her own shortcomings had triggered his controlling behavior. The idea that this was simply who he was, and that she was just his latest victim, was both devastating and oddly liberating. There's more, Emma continued. One of his former business partners is willing to testify about Jonathan's reaction when she challenged him during a board meeting. He apparently became so enraged that security had to be called, and she ultimately left the company rather than continue working with him. Mac's expression grew thoughtful as he processed this information through the lens of his military intelligence training. He has a documented pattern of aggressive behavior when challenged or when he feels his control is threatened. That's useful. But it also makes him more dangerous, Sarah pointed out. Men like Jonathan don't typically escalate gradually. When they feel their control slipping, they tend to pull out all the stops. As if summoned by their conversation, Rebecca's phone rang with Jonathan's name on the caller ID. Mac reached for it, but Rebecca shook her head and answered the call herself, putting it on speaker so the others could hear. Rebecca, thank God. Jonathan's voice carried perfectly calibrated relief and concern. I've been worried sick about you. Are you okay? Is the baby okay? We're fine, Jonathan, Rebecca said quietly, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. I need some time to think. Think about what? Jonathan's tone shifted slightly, becoming more controlling. Think about destroying our marriage? Think about keeping my child away from me? Rebecca, this is insane. You're 7 months pregnant. You have no job, no money, no way to take care of yourself. You need to come home. I don't need anything from you, Rebecca said, the words carrying a strength that surprised even her. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself and my daughter. The silence that followed was loaded with Jonathan's shock and rage at being contradicted. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to that dangerous whisper that Rebecca had learned to fear. Your daughter, he repeated. That's my child you're carrying, Rebecca. My daughter. And no court in the country will let you keep her if you continue down this path. Mac gestured for Rebecca to end the call, but she shook her head. She needed to hear what Jonathan was really threatening, needed to understand the full scope of what she was facing. "What path is that, Jonathan?" she asked quietly. "The path of listening to people who don't have your best interests at heart," Jonathan replied, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used in business negotiations. "Your brother is a combat veteran with documented PTSD. He's violent, unstable, and he's filling your head with paranoid delusions about our marriage. Any family court judge will see that you're not making rational decisions." Mac's hands clenched into fists, but Emma put a restraining hand on his arm. They needed to hear Jonathan's full strategy before they could counter it effectively. "I love you, Rebecca," Jonathan continued, his voice shifting back to manufactured concern. "But I love our daughter more than my own life, and I won't let you put her in danger because you're confused and scared. Come home today and we can get you the help you need. Stay away, and I'll have to take steps to protect our child." The threat was clear, even couched in language of love and protection. Rebecca looked around the table at Mac's furious expression, Emma's professional assessment, and felt something inside her shift and crystallize. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "the only person our daughter needs protection from is you." She ended the call before he could respond, then immediately turned off the phone and handed it to Mac. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "He's going to try to have me declared mentally incompetent, isn't he? He's going to claim I'm an unfit mother and try to take the baby." Sarah's expression was grim but determined. "Probably, but Rebecca, we're not going to let that happen. Emma, how quickly can you get those other women to provide written statements about Jonathan's behavior?" "I can have preliminary statements by this afternoon," Emma replied. "And I'm working on getting one more witness, Jonathan's former housekeeper who worked for him during his relationship with the business associate. She apparently witnessed several incidents of controlling and threatening behavior." Max stood up from the table with the kind of decisive movement that suggested he'd reached a tactical decision. "Becca, I want you to pack a bag, not just for a few days. Pack everything you might need for an extended stay." "Extended stay?" Rebecca asked. "We're going back to the house while Jonathan's at work to get your important documents, personal items, and anything else you might need," Mac explained. "If this is going to be a prolonged legal battle, you need to have access to your own belongings and documentation." Sarah looked up from her legal pad. "Actually, that's a good idea. We'll need copies of financial records, medical documents, anything that shows the pattern of control. Plus, if there are hidden cameras or monitoring devices, we might be able to document them." Emma's expression was thoughtful. "Rebecca, when you were living there, did you ever feel like Jonathan knew things about your activities that you hadn't told him? Phone calls you'd made, websites you'd visited, people you'd talked to?" Rebecca nodded, remembering countless incidents where Jonathan had referenced conversations or activities that she couldn't remember mentioning to him. "All the time. I thought I was just forgetting what I told him. But now we know he was probably monitoring everything," Mac finished grimly, "which means we need to assume he's still tracking your phone, your email, possibly even this conversation if he's managed to place listening devices." The idea that Jonathan might be listening to their planning session sent a chill through Rebecca, but it also strengthened her resolve. If he was willing to go to those extremes to maintain control, then everything Mac and Emma and Sarah had told her about his abusive behavior was not just true, it was probably worse than they'd imagined. "When do we go?" Rebecca asked quietly. Mac checked his watch. "Jonathan's board meeting runs until 4:30 according to his company website. If we leave now, we'll have about 3 hours to document everything and get out safely." As they prepared to leave, Rebecca caught sight of herself in Emma's hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The designer clothes and carefully styled appearance that Jonathan had insisted on were gone, replaced by borrowed jeans and one of Emma's comfortable sweaters. But more than her appearance had changed, there was something different in her eyes, a strength and determination that she hadn't seen in years. She was no longer the isolated, frightened woman who'd sat in Henderson's diner yesterday afternoon. She was Rebecca Thompson, raised by parents who'd taught her that some things were worth fighting for. supported by a brother who'd learned in combat zones that protecting innocent people was the highest calling. Married to a man who was about to discover that money and power weren't always enough to win every battle. The war for her daughter's future was about to escalate, but Rebecca was no longer fighting it alone. Rebecca went into early labor at 2:37 in the morning, jolted awake by contractions that felt different from the practice contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. Emma, sleeping in the guest room next door, heard her cry out and appeared immediately with the calm efficiency of someone trained to handle medical emergencies. "How far apart?" Emma asked, timing the contractions while Mac called Dr. Crawford's emergency line. "Every 3 minutes," Rebecca gasped, her hand protectively covering her belly. "But it's too early. She's not due for another 6 weeks." The drive to the hospital was a blur of pain and fear, with Mac navigating traffic while Emma sat in the back seat monitoring Rebecca's condition and providing steady reassurance. The emergency room staff moved quickly, recognizing the signs of premature labor, complicated by what Dr. Crawford would later document as extreme maternal distress consistent with domestic violence trauma. "We need to stop these contractions," Dr. Crawford explained as they prepared to administer medications to halt the premature labor. "The baby's lungs aren't fully developed yet, and every day she stays inside is crucial for her development." Rebecca nodded through another contraction, focusing on the medical equipment surrounding her bed rather than the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. This was exactly what Jonathan had predicted would happen, that her decision to leave would endanger the baby, that her actions would prove she was an unfit mother. "This is my fault," she whispered to Emma, who was holding her hand during the medical procedures. "If I hadn't left, if I hadn't caused all this stress—" "Stop right there," Dr. Crawford interrupted firmly. "Rebecca, I've been your doctor for 6 months, and I've been documenting concerning signs throughout your pregnancy. Elevated blood pressure, chronic stress indicators, unexplained bruising, weight loss despite being pregnant. This labor isn't caused by leaving an abusive situation. It's caused by the chronic stress of living in one." The words hit Rebecca with unexpected force. Dr. Crawford had been seeing the signs of abuse all along and had been carefully documenting them in her medical records. The early labor wasn't evidence of Rebecca's failure as a mother. It was evidence of the systematic damage that Jonathan's abuse had inflicted on both her and their unborn child. Max sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair next to Rebecca's bed, his military training automatically cataloging security concerns and potential threats. The hospital staff had been briefed about the domestic violence situation and had placed Rebecca in a room with restricted access. But Mac knew that Jonathan's wealth and influence could overcome many institutional safeguards. His concerns proved justified when Jonathan arrived at the hospital barely an hour after they'd been admitted, accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the confident arrogance of lawyers who were accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and legal threats. "Where is my wife?" Jonathan demanded at the nurse's station, his voice carrying the kind of authority that usually made people comply immediately. "I'm Jonathan Pierce, and my wife Rebecca is in premature labor. I demand to see her immediately." The head nurse, a veteran of 30 years who dealt with every kind of family crisis imaginable, looked at Jonathan with the kind of professional politeness that carried no warmth whatsoever. "Sir, your wife is in a secure unit receiving medical care. She's conscious and able to make her own decisions about visitors." "She's 7 months pregnant and in labor," one of Jonathan's lawyers interjected. "She's not in a condition to make rational decisions. Her husband has legal rights as next of kin and father of the child." Mac appeared in the hallway at that moment, and the temperature in the corridor seemed to drop several degrees as the 2 men faced each other across the sterile institutional space. Jonathan's perfectly tailored appearance and expensive legal backup contrasted sharply with Mac's casual clothes and calm, alert bearing. "Colonel Thompson," Jonathan said with forced civility, "I'm glad you're here. Perhaps you can explain to the hospital staff that my wife needs her husband during this medical crisis." "Your wife," Mac replied quietly, "has made it very clear that she doesn't want to see you. The hospital staff is simply respecting her wishes." Jonathan's facade of control cracked slightly, revealing the rage underneath. "She's in premature labor because of the stress you've caused her. Your interference in our marriage has endangered my child, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." Dr. Crawford emerged from Rebecca's room at that moment, and her expression when she saw Jonathan was professionally cool but loaded with disapproval. At 51, she delivered thousands of babies and had learned to recognize the signs of domestic violence with disturbing frequency. "Mr. Pierce," she said formally, "your wife is stable, and we've successfully stopped the premature labor for now. However, she needs complete bed rest and minimal stress to prevent future episodes." "Then you understand why she needs to come home where I can properly care for her," Jonathan said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone that had built his business empire. "This military base housing situation is clearly not appropriate for a high-risk pregnancy." "Actually, Doctor," Crawford replied with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of medical practice, "what I understand is that your wife's medical condition has dramatically improved since she left your home. Her blood pressure is lower than it's been in months, her stress indicators are normalized, and she's finally getting proper nutrition and sleep." The words hit Jonathan like a slap, and Mac could see him struggling to maintain his carefully constructed image in front of the hospital staff and his legal team. The implication that Rebecca's health had improved dramatically after leaving him was a direct challenge to his narrative of being the concerned husband protecting his unstable wife. "I want to see her," Jonathan said, abandoning persuasion for direct demand. "I have rights as her husband and the father of this child." "You have the right to request a visit," Dr. Crawford corrected. "She has the right to refuse. And given the documented history of domestic violence and the current restraining order, the hospital's policy is to defer to the patient's wishes in these situations." Jonathan's face flushed red with rage and humiliation. Being denied access by medical staff in front of witnesses was exactly the kind of public rejection that his ego couldn't tolerate. Mac could see him calculating his options, and none of them were good for anyone involved. "This isn't over," Jonathan said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that Rebecca had learned to fear. "I'll be back with court orders if necessary. That's my child she's carrying, and no one has the right to keep me away from my own family." After Jonathan and his legal team left, Mac returned to Rebecca's room to find her connected to monitoring equipment that tracked both her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat. The steady electronic sounds were reassuring, but Rebecca's expression was filled with guilt and fear. "He's right, isn't he?" she said quietly. "This happened because I left him. The stress of all this fighting caused the early labor." Dr. Crawford pulled up a chair next to Rebecca's bed, her expression serious but kind. "Rebecca, I'm going to tell you something that I probably should have said months ago, but I was hoping you'd reach out for help on your own. Your pregnancy has been medically complicated from the beginning due to chronic stress, malnutrition, and what I now recognize as classic signs of domestic abuse." Rebecca stared at her doctor in shock. "You knew?" "I suspected," Dr. Crawford admitted. "The weight loss during pregnancy, the elevated blood pressure, the way you flinched when I examined areas where you had bruising. But suspecting abuse and proving it are two different things, and many women aren't ready to acknowledge what's happening until they're ready to take action." Mac leaned forward in his chair. "So Rebecca leaving didn't cause this medical crisis?" "Rebecca leaving probably prevented a much worse medical crisis," Dr. Crawford said firmly. "Chronic stress during pregnancy can cause premature labor, low birth weight, developmental delays, and a host of other complications. The fact that we were able to stop this episode and that both mother and baby are now stable is actually remarkable given what she's been enduring." The relief that flooded through Rebecca was overwhelming, and she finally allowed herself to cry, not from fear or guilt, but from the release of 2 years of believing that everything was her fault. Dr. Crawford squeezed her hand gently and continued, "Rebecca, I'm going to be documenting everything in your medical records. The improvement in your condition since leaving the abusive situation, the physical evidence of domestic violence, the correlation between your stress levels and your pregnancy complications. If this goes to court, you'll have medical testimony that leaving was not only the right decision, it was medically necessary to protect both you and your daughter." Emma appeared in the doorway with coffee and the kind of practical updates that kept complicated situations manageable. "Sarah's filing an emergency motion to modify the restraining order to include hospital visits. Jonathan's lawyers can't override medical decisions or patient rights. no matter how much money they have. Max stood up and moved to the window, automatically scanning the parking lot for any sign of Jonathan's continued surveillance. His military training had taught him that tactical victories were often temporary, and Jonathan's retreat from the hospital didn't mean he was giving up. It meant he was regrouping and planning his next offensive. "What's our next move?" Mac asked. Emma consulted her notes with the efficiency of someone who'd coordinated multiple military family crises. "Short term, we keep Rebecca safe and stable until the baby's born. Long term, we build the strongest possible case for permanent custody and protection orders. Dr. Crawford's medical documentation will be crucial, but we also need to be prepared for Jonathan to escalate his efforts." As if summoned by their conversation, Rebecca's new secure phone, a device that Jonathan couldn't track or monitor, buzzed with a text message from Sarah Mitchell. The message was brief but ominous. "Jonathan's team just filed emergency custody motions, claiming Rebecca is mentally unstable, and the military family is holding her against her will. Court hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning." Rebecca read the message and felt the familiar fear beginning to rise in her chest. But this time, instead of the isolated terror that had characterized the past 2 years, she was surrounded by people who understood that this was exactly the kind of legal warfare that abusers use to maintain control over their victims. "Tomorrow morning," she said quietly, looking around at Mac's determined expression, Emma's professional competence, and Dr. Crawford's medical authority. "He's really going to try to have me declared incompetent. And we're really going to stop him," Mac replied with the kind of quiet certainty that had sustained him through combat zones and was now focused on protecting his sister and niece. The battle was moving to the courtroom, but for the first time since this war began, Rebecca felt like she had the weapons and allies she needed to fight back effectively. Outside in the hospital parking lot, Jonathan sat in his Mercedes making phone calls with the animated gestures of someone marshaling considerable resources for a decisive campaign. But inside Rebecca's hospital room, the woman he'd spent 2 years systematically breaking was discovering that she was much stronger than either of them had realized. The courtroom battle Rebecca faced required more than legal arguments and medical testimony. It needed intelligence about Jonathan's history, his methods, and his vulnerabilities. Mac applied the same systematic approach to gathering information that had served him in military intelligence, while Emma used her counseling networks to reach women who'd experienced similar situations. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Catherine Pierce, Jonathan's 62-year-old mother, who arrived at the hospital unannounced on Thursday morning carrying flowers and wearing an expression of determined guilt. "I need to speak with Rebecca," Catherine told Mac, her voice carrying the kind of refined authority that came from decades of high society charity work and corporate wife duties. "I need to apologize for my son's behavior, and I need to help stop him." Mac's initial instinct was protective. Another Pierce family member could easily be part of Jonathan's manipulation campaign, but something in Catherine's posture, the way she carried herself like someone who'd made a difficult decision and was prepared to face the consequences, made him pause. "Mrs. Pierce," Max said carefully, "Rebecca is in a secure unit due to the restraining order against your son. I can't just—" "Colonel Thompson," Catherine interrupted, "I know exactly why my daughter-in-law needs protection from my son. I've known for years what kind of man Jonathan really is, and I've been a coward for not speaking up sooner." Emma appeared in the hospital corridor at that moment, having been alerted by the nurse's station about Catherine's arrival. Her counselor training allowed her to quickly assess Catherine's emotional state, genuine remorse mixed with determination, not the calculated manipulation they'd learned to expect from Jonathan's associates. "Mrs. Pierce," Emma said gently, "what did you mean when you said you've known for years?" Catherine's composure cracked slightly, revealing the pain underneath her polished exterior. "I mean that Jonathan learned his controlling behavior from his father, and I spent 35 years making excuses for both of them instead of protecting the people they hurt." The revelation that Jonathan's abusive behavior was generational, learned from his father and enabled by his mother, provided crucial context for understanding his psychology and predicting his tactics. Emma guided Catherine to a quiet family conference room where they could talk privately. "Tell us about Jonathan's father," Emma said, her voice carrying the professional gentleness that encouraged people to share difficult truths. Catherine sat rigidly in the uncomfortable hospital chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she prepared to reveal family secrets that had been carefully hidden behind wealth and social status for decades. Richard was controlling, Catherine said quietly. He needed to know where I was every moment, who I talked to, how I spent money. He monitored my phone calls, had people watch me when he was traveling, made sure I was completely dependent on him financially and socially. Mac exchanged a meaningful look with Emma. The pattern was identical to what Jonathan had inflicted on Rebecca. Systematic isolation, financial control, surveillance, and psychological manipulation. Did he ever become physical? Emma asked gently. Catherine's laugh was bitter and short. Richard was too smart for that. Physical violence leaves evidence. But he had other ways of making sure I understood the consequences of disobedience. He had my best friend fired from her job when he decided she was a bad influence. He had my sister's husband's business loan denied when I spent too much time visiting her family. He never had to hit me. He just had to hurt people I cared about. The sophistication of Richard Pierce's abuse methods explained a lot about Jonathan's current strategy. Like father, like son, both men understood that indirect threats and consequences were often more effective than direct violence because they were harder to prove and easier to deny. Jonathan learned from watching his father, Catherine continued. Even as a child, he understood that power meant controlling other people's choices and making them dependent on your approval. When he was 16, he systematically destroyed his girlfriend's relationship with her best friend because he decided the friend was jealous of their relationship. Emma took notes steadily, recognizing the importance of establishing Jonathan's long-term pattern of abusive behavior. In custody battles, demonstrating that the abuse wasn't situational, but rather a fundamental aspect of the abuser's personality, was often crucial. "Why are you telling us this now?" Mac asked. "Why didn't you speak up when Rebecca first married your son?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears, and her carefully maintained composure finally crumbled completely. "Because I'm a coward. Because I spent 35 years telling myself that Richard's control was love, that Jonathan's behavior was just intensity or passion. I convinced myself that if I just tried harder, if I just understood them better, I could make them happy enough to stop hurting other people." The psychology of enablement was familiar to Emma from her counseling work. Family members who became so focused on managing the abuser's emotions that they lost sight of protecting the victims. Catherine's guilt was genuine, but it was also an opportunity to gather crucial intelligence about Jonathan's methods and mindset. "Catherine," Emma said gently, "we need to understand how Jonathan thinks, how he plans, what his next moves might be. Can you help us with that?" Catherine wiped her eyes with a tissue and straightened her shoulders, summoning the kind of upper-class composure that had carried her through decades of social obligations and family crises. "Jonathan doesn't just react to situations, he orchestrates them," she said with growing clarity. "When that business partner challenged him in the board meeting, he spent 6 months systematically undermining her reputation, her client relationships, and her professional credibility. By the time she finally left the company, everyone believed she was incompetent and unstable." Mac leaned forward, his military intelligence training recognizing the importance of understanding enemy tactics. "What about his romantic relationships? How did he handle breakups or rejection?" "He didn't handle them at all," Catherine replied. "He prevented them. Every woman who tried to leave Jonathan found herself facing financial difficulties, professional sabotage, or threats to family members. Most of them eventually decided it was easier to comply than to fight." "But some of them did fight," Emma pointed out. "We've been in contact with several women who escaped his relationships." Catherine nodded grimly. "The ones who got away had resources he couldn't touch: family money, professional connections, legal protection. Jonathan only wins when he can isolate his victims and control all their options." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah Mitchell's arrival, her professional composure slightly disheveled from the emergency motion hearings she'd been attending all morning. She carried a thick folder of legal documents and wore the kind of determined expression that suggested both good news and bad news. "Catherine," Sarah said with surprise, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm here to help stop my son," Catherine replied with quiet dignity. "I should have done it years ago." Sarah looked at Mac and Emma with questioning expressions, and Emma quickly briefed her on Catherine's revelations about the generational pattern of abuse and Jonathan's systematic methods of control and retaliation. "This is incredibly valuable," Sarah said, reviewing her notes. "Catherine, would you be willing to provide sworn testimony about Jonathan's history and methods?" Catherine's hands shook slightly, but her voice was steady when she answered. "Yes, I'll testify about everything. Jonathan's childhood behavior, his father's methods, the pattern I've watched him repeat with every woman in his life. I should have spoken up years ago." Sarah made notes rapidly, her legal mind already cataloging how Catherine's testimony could counter Jonathan's narrative of being a concerned husband, protecting his mentally unstable wife from dangerous outside influences. "There's something else," Catherine continued. "Jonathan has been planning for the possibility of Rebecca leaving for months. He hired a private investigator 6 months ago to document what he called her erratic behavior and concerning associations." Mac's expression darkened. "He's been building a case against Rebecca while systematically isolating and abusing her?" "It's what his father would have done," Catherine confirmed. "Create the problem, document the victim's reaction to the problem, then use those reactions as evidence of instability." Emma's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Dr. Crawford. "Jonathan's lawyers just tried to have Rebecca's medical records subpoenaed. Hospital legal department is fighting it, but we need to move quickly." The urgency of the situation crystallized around them. Jonathan wasn't just fighting for custody, he was fighting to control the narrative, to position himself as the victim of his wife's mental instability and his brother-in-law's violent influence. "We need those other women to go on record," Sarah said with growing determination. "Catherine's testimony is powerful, but we need multiple voices establishing the pattern." Emma was already making phone calls, using her network of counselors and advocates to reach the women who'd previously shared their experiences with Jonathan's controlling behavior. The response was mixed. Some were too afraid of retaliation to go public, but others had been waiting years for someone to hold Jonathan accountable. By evening, they had sworn statements from 3 women detailing Jonathan's systematic methods of control, isolation, and retaliation. More importantly, they had Catherine Pierce's testimony about the generational nature of the abuse and Jonathan's long-term planning for this exact scenario. "He's been preparing for this custody battle since Rebecca got pregnant," Catherine revealed during their final planning session. "He told me that he'd learned from his father's mistakes, that Richard had been too reactive, too emotional. Jonathan planned to be more strategic." Max studied the intelligence they'd gathered with the same systematic approach he'd used to plan military operations. "So he's not just fighting for custody, he's fighting to maintain control over Rebecca and the baby as a long-term strategy." "Exactly," Catherine confirmed. "In Jonathan's mind, losing this battle means losing face, losing control, losing the image of perfection he's spent his entire adult life constructing. He'll use every resource he has to prevent that from happening." Rocking. The next morning brought news that confirmed Catherine's assessment of her son's ruthless determination. Jonathan had filed additional motions claiming that Rebecca's association with Mac posed a direct threat to the unborn child due to Mac's combat-related PTSD, and that her decision to involve outside agitators in their marriage proved her mental instability. But Jonathan had underestimated the strength of the opposition he was facing. Rebecca was no longer an isolated victim with no resources or support. She was surrounded by a decorated military officer, a licensed counselor, an experienced family lawyer, a medical professional documenting the health benefits of leaving the abusive situation, and now his own mother testifying about his lifelong pattern of controlling behavior. The intelligence gathering phase was complete. Now came the real battle. In a courtroom where Jonathan's money and influence would be challenged by evidence, testimony, and the kind of family loyalty that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Judge Patricia Williamson had presided over family court for 15 years, and she'd learned to recognize the difference between genuine concern for a child's welfare and sophisticated manipulation disguised as parental protection. The emergency custody hearing that brought Jonathan Pierce and his high-powered legal team before her bench carried all the hallmarks of the latter. Jonathan's lead attorney, Marcus Rothschild, was everything that $50 million could buy. Harvard-educated, perfectly groomed, and possessed of the kind of polished arrogance that assumed judges would be impressed by expensive suits and veiled threats about political connections. "Your Honor," Rothschild began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to winning through intimidation, "we are here today to protect an unborn child from a dangerous and deteriorating family situation. My client's wife has been coerced by her brother, a combat veteran with documented PTSD, into abandoning her home and endangering her pregnancy." Rebecca sat at the defendant's table next to Sarah Mitchell, her hands folded protectively over her 7-month pregnant belly. The contrast between Jonathan's expensive legal team and their modest representation was stark, but Sarah had assured her that truth was often more powerful than money in family court. "Furthermore," Rothschild continued, "Mrs. Pierce has been hospitalized due to premature labor directly caused by the stress of her brother's interference in their marriage. She is clearly not capable of making rational decisions about her own welfare or that of her unborn child." Judge Williamson listened impassively, her expression revealing nothing about her assessment of the arguments being presented. At 54, she'd heard every variation of custody dispute imaginable, but something about this case had caught her attention during the preliminary motions. "Mr. Rothschild," Judge Williamson interrupted, "you're asking this court to compel a pregnant woman to return to a home she left voluntarily after what appears to be documented domestic violence. That's a significant request that requires significant evidence." Rothschild smiled with the confidence of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for exactly this challenge. "Your Honor, we have extensive documentation of Mrs. Pierce's increasingly erratic behavior over the past months. Social isolation, paranoid accusations about her husband's normal business activities, and most recently, complete abandonment of her marital responsibilities." Sarah Mitchell stood to address the court, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from 15 years of fighting for domestic violence survivors in family court. "Your Honor, what Mr. Rothschild characterizes as erratic behavior is actually the normal response of an abuse victim to systematic control, isolation, and intimidation. We have independent medical testimony, security footage, and witness statements documenting a clear pattern of domestic violence." "Alleged domestic violence," Rothschild corrected smoothly. "Mrs. Pierce has never filed charges, never sought medical treatment for injuries, never contacted domestic violence resources. Her sudden accusations conveniently coincide with her brother's return from military deployment and his clear intention to interfere in their marriage." The back and forth continued for an hour, with both sides presenting their evidence and witnesses. Jonathan took the stand as his own first witness, presenting himself as the concerned husband whose successful career and stable home environment provided the ideal situation for raising their daughter. "Your Honor," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the persuasive charm that had built his business empire, "I love my wife more than life itself. Her pregnancy has been difficult, and I understand that hormonal changes and stress can affect judgment and emotional stability. I just want to bring her home where I can take care of her and our daughter properly." Under cross-examination by Sarah Mitchell, Jonathan's polished facade began to show cracks. "Mr. Pierce," Sarah asked, "is it true that you installed tracking software on your wife's phone without her knowledge?" "I wanted to ensure her safety," Jonathan replied smoothly. "A pregnant woman driving alone can face unexpected situations, and I needed to be able to find her if something happened." "Is it true that you froze your wife's access to your joint bank accounts after she left your home?" Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. "I was concerned about her mental state and wanted to prevent her from making financial decisions that might not be in her best interest or the baby's." "So you made the decision to leave her without access to money for food, medical care, or basic necessities?" "She had everything she needed at home," Jonathan said, his voice taking on an edge that Judge Williamson didn't miss. "If she'd stayed where she belonged instead of listening to outside influences, she wouldn't have needed independent access to funds." The phrase "where she belonged" hung in the courtroom air, revealing more about Jonathan's mindset than hours of testimony about his love and concern for Rebecca's welfare. Mac took the stand next, his military bearing and calm demeanor providing a stark contrast to Jonathan's polished businessman persona. Sarah guided him through his qualifications, his service record, and his current mental health status, establishing that he was neither unstable nor violent despite Jonathan's claims. "Colonel Thompson," Sarah asked, "please describe your sister's condition when you first saw her at Henderson's diner." Mac's voice was steady and professional as he recounted the scene. Jonathan's grip on Rebecca's bruised wrist, her defensive posture, her fear when asked about her situation. His military training and threat assessment lent credibility to his observations about domestic violence indicators. Under cross-examination, Rothschild tried to portray Mac as a dangerous combat veteran whose PTSD made him an unreliable witness and a threat to family stability. "Colonel Thompson," Rothschild asked, "how many people did you kill during your military service?" Sarah immediately objected, but Mac answered calmly, "Sir, I served my country honorably in defense of freedom and the protection of innocent people. My military service taught me to recognize threats and protect those who cannot protect themselves, including using physical force against my client when he was simply trying to talk to his wife. Sir, I used minimal necessary force to prevent your client from continuing to physically assault my pregnant sister. My training taught me to de-escalate situations while protecting innocent people from harm." The answer was perfect, delivered with the kind of calm authority that made Rothschild's attempts at character assassination seem petty and desperate. Dr. Crawford's testimony provided medical evidence of the improvement in Rebecca's health since leaving the abusive situation, while Emma's professional assessment as a licensed counselor established the psychological patterns typical of domestic violence cases. But the most devastating testimony came from Catherine Pierce. Taking the stand in a simple black dress, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the emotional weight of testifying against her own son, Catherine spoke with the quiet dignity of someone who'd finally found the courage to do the right thing. "Mrs. Pierce," Sarah asked gently, "please tell the court about your observations of your son's behavior toward women throughout his life." Catherine's voice was steady, but filled with years of suppressed truth. "Jonathan learned controlling behavior from his father. I watched him systematically isolate and manipulate every woman he dated, starting in high school. The pattern was always the same: initial charm, then gradual control, isolation from friends and family, financial dependence, and threats of consequences if they tried to leave." Rothschild's cross-examination of Catherine was brutal, attacking her as a bitter divorced woman trying to get revenge on her ex-husband through their son. But Catherine's responses were calm and factual, backed by specific examples of Jonathan's behavior dating back to his teenage years. "Mrs. Pierce," Rothschild said with barely concealed contempt, "isn't it true that you're financially dependent on your son and might lose that support if you don't testify as he wishes?" Catherine's smile was sad but determined. "Mr. Rothschild, I've been financially controlled by men my entire adult life. First by my husband, then by my son. Testifying truthfully today might cost me that financial security, but it's the first honest thing I've done in 30 years, and it's worth any price." The courtroom fell silent at her words, and Judge Williamson made notes with renewed attention to detail. When all the testimony was complete, Judge Williamson recessed for an hour to review the evidence and prepare her ruling. Rebecca sat in the courthouse hallway with Mac, Emma, and Sarah, trying to process everything that had happened. "How do you think it went?" Rebecca asked quietly. Sarah's expression was cautiously optimistic. "Jonathan hurt himself when he revealed his true attitude about where you belong." Catherine's testimony was powerful, and Dr. Crawford's medical evidence directly contradicts his claims about your mental instability. But judges can be unpredictable, especially when there's this much money involved. When court reconvened, Judge Williamson's expression was serious but determined. "This court has heard extensive testimony about a marriage in crisis and competing claims about the best interests of an unborn child," she began. "However, the evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Pierce's health and stability have improved dramatically since leaving what the medical testimony confirms was an abusive situation." Rebecca's heart stopped as she waited for the ruling that would determine her future and her daughter's safety. "The petition for emergency custody is denied," Judge Williamson continued. "The temporary restraining order against Mr. Pierce is extended and modified to include all forms of contact except through court-approved legal channels. Mrs. Pierce will remain in her current living situation with full medical and legal autonomy." The ruling was a complete victory, but Judge Williamson wasn't finished. "Mr. Pierce," she said, looking directly at Jonathan, "this court found your testimony concerning, particularly your statements about where your wife belongs and your justifications for financial control and surveillance. These behaviors are inconsistent with a healthy marriage and raise serious questions about your fitness as a parent. Jonathan's face flushed red with humiliation and rage, but he was smart enough not to speak in open court. This court will be monitoring this situation closely, Judge Williamson concluded, and any violations of the restraining order will result in immediate arrest and additional charges. As they left the courthouse, Rebecca felt the weight of 2 years of fear and control finally lifting from her shoulders. She'd won not just the legal battle, but the right to determine her own future and protect her daughter from the cycle of abuse that had defined the Pierce family for generations. Jonathan stood outside the courthouse with his legal team, his carefully constructed image finally cracking under the weight of public failure and judicial rebuke. For the first time in his adult life, his money and influence hadn't been enough to control the outcome, and everyone could see it. The war wasn't over, but Rebecca had won the most important battle, the right to be free. 3 weeks after the courthouse victory, Rebecca stood in the small apartment she'd rented with Mac and Emma's help, watching the sunrise through windows that Jonathan couldn't monitor. The space was modest compared to the mansion she'd shared with her husband, but it belonged to her in a way that the designer-decorated prison never had. The apartment came furnished with the basics, supplemented by donations from the military community network that Emma had connected her with. Other women who'd escaped abusive relationships had contributed everything from baby clothes to kitchen supplies, creating a sisterhood of survivors that provided both practical support and emotional validation. Dr. Crawford's medical clearance had allowed Rebecca to begin working part-time at a nonprofit organization that provided services to domestic violence survivors. The irony of her first job after leaving Jonathan being focused on helping other women in similar situations wasn't lost on her. It was healing in a way she hadn't expected. "The director called this morning," Emma said, settling into Rebecca's small kitchen with coffee and the kind of practical updates that kept complicated transitions manageable. "The grant funding came through for the expanded counseling program. They want to offer you the full-time position as program coordinator when you're ready after the baby's born." Rebecca's hand moved instinctively to her belly, now 34 weeks along and growing stronger every day since leaving the chronically stressful environment of her marriage. The baby girl seemed to sense her mother's improved emotional state, settling into healthier sleep patterns and movement cycles that Dr. Crawford noted with satisfaction during their weekly checkups. "Full-time coordinator," Rebecca repeated, testing the words and finding they felt right in a way that CEO wife never had. "I'd be helping other women who are where I was 6 months ago. You'd be proving to them that escape is possible, that life after abuse can be not just survivable, but fulfilling," Emma corrected gently. "Sometimes survivors need to see someone who's made it through successfully before they can believe it's possible for themselves." Mac appeared in the kitchen doorway, having just finished his morning run around the military base housing complex, where Rebecca now felt safe walking alone for the first time in 2 years. His transition back to civilian life had been smoother than expected, partly because helping Rebecca had given him a sense of purpose that translated his military protective instincts into civilian service. "Coffee smells good," Max said, settling into the third chair around Rebecca's small table. "Dorothy called to check on you, by the way. Henderson's Diner is thinking about starting a weekly support group meeting, and she wants to know if you'd be interested in helping facilitate it." The idea of returning to Henderson's Diner, where her nightmare had escalated, but also where her rescue had begun, felt like closing an important circle. Dorothy Henderson had become an unexpected ally and friend, someone who understood that sometimes the most important interventions happened in ordinary places by ordinary people who chose to get involved. "I think I'd like that," Rebecca said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "Dot saved my life by recording Jonathan's assault. Maybe we can help save other lives by providing a safe space for women to talk about what they're experiencing." Emma's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Mitchell. "Jonathan's lawyers filed an appeal, but it's mostly procedural posturing. More importantly, the IRS is auditing Pierce Technologies based on anonymous tips about financial irregularities. Karma works in mysterious ways." The news that Jonathan's business empire was facing scrutiny brought a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Rebecca knew that financial pressure would only increase his anger and desperation, but she also knew that his pattern of controlling behavior probably extended to his business practices in ways that wouldn't withstand professional investigation. Are we safe or some? Rebecca asked, voicing the question that still woke her up some nights despite the restraining orders and security measures. Mac's expression was serious but reassuring. Base security is solid. Your apartment building has good protocols, and we've established check-in routines that would alert us immediately if anything seemed wrong. More importantly, Jonathan's public reputation has taken a major hit, and continuing to harass you would only make his legal situation worse. The restraining order had been extended for a full year, with provisions that any contact attempts would result in immediate arrest. Jonathan's expensive lawyers had managed to keep him out of jail for the original assault, but they'd made it clear that any future violations would have serious consequences that even his wealth couldn't circumvent. Rebecca's new phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, and for a moment her old fear spiked. But the text was from Jennifer Walsh, the law school classmate who'd been forced to transfer schools due to Jonathan's harassment campaign years earlier. "Saw the news about your court case," the message read. "Wanted you to know that 3 other women have come forward with similar stories about Jonathan. We're considering a civil suit for damages. Would you be interested in joining us?" The possibility of holding Jonathan accountable not just for what he'd done to her, but for a pattern of behavior spanning over a decade, felt like justice in a way that the restraining order couldn't quite achieve. More importantly, it felt like preventing him from doing to other women what he'd done to her, in Jennifer and the others. "Civil suit," Rebecca said, showing the message to Mac and Emma. "Multiple plaintiffs, pattern evidence, financial damages for therapy, lost careers, medical expenses." Emma's expression was thoughtful. "It's a big step, more public exposure, more stress, more of your time and energy focused on Jonathan instead of building your new life, but also more protection for future victims," Mac pointed out, "and more accountability for someone who's spent his entire adult life believing he can control and hurt people without consequences." Rebecca stood up from the kitchen table and moved to the window that looked out over the apartment complex playground, where children played safely under their parents' watchful eyes. This was the world she wanted for her daughter. One where being female didn't mean being vulnerable, where love meant support rather than control, where strength was measured by how you protected others rather than how you dominated them. "I want to do it," she said quietly. "I want to stop him from hurting anyone else." The decision felt right in a way that few choices had during her marriage. For 2 years, every decision had been filtered through what Jonathan would think, how he would react, whether it would trigger his anger or disappointment. Now she was making choices based on her own values and the kind of world she wanted to create for her daughter. Emma was already making notes about logistics and timeline considerations. "We'll need to coordinate with Sarah, establish counseling support for the stress of litigation, make sure your financial stability isn't threatened by legal expenses. The nonprofit law clinic has offered to take the case pro bono if we go forward," Max said, checking his messages from their legal support network. "They see it as an opportunity to establish precedent about financial abuse and coercive control in civil court." Rebecca's daughter chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, as if she approved of her mother's decision to fight back against the man who would have been her father but had never understood what that role truly meant. "She's going to grow up knowing that her mother fought for her freedom," Rebecca said, her hand covering the spot where tiny feet were practicing their strength. "She's going to know that some things are worth fighting for, even when it's scary." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at Rebecca's door, followed by Dorothy Henderson's familiar voice calling out a greeting. Dot appeared in the kitchen carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that suggested good news. "Thought you might like to know," Dot announced without preamble, "that Henderson's Diner just got written up in the state paper as an example of community businesses supporting domestic violence survivors. Apparently word got out about how we handled your situation, and now other business owners are asking for training on how to recognize and respond to abuse situations." The news that their confrontation at the diner had inspired broader community action felt like validation of Rebecca's decision to speak up rather than suffer in silence. Change happened when individual people chose to get involved, to record evidence, to offer support, to stand up to bullies even when those bullies had $50 million and expensive lawyers. "There's something else," Dot continued, her expression growing more serious. Got a call from a reporter yesterday asking questions about Jonathan Pierce and his business practices. Seems like your court case opened up some doors that were better left closed, if you know what I mean. Rebecca nodded, understanding that Jonathan's public image as a successful, stable businessman was crumbling under scrutiny that he'd never faced before. When domestic abusers operated in private, they could maintain their public facades indefinitely. But once their behavior became public record, other victims found the courage to speak up. Other witnesses came forward, and patterns that had been carefully hidden became undeniably clear. As evening fell over Rebecca's new apartment, she sat in the rocking chair that Mac had assembled for the baby's room, looking at ultrasound photos of the daughter who would be born free. The contrast between this peaceful moment and the fear that had characterized her pregnancy just weeks earlier was stark and profound. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Mitchell. Court date set for civil suit. 6 plaintiffs so far, spanning 12 years of Jonathan's behavior. This could be the case that finally holds him accountable. Rebecca looked at the message and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just hope for her own future, but hope that her daughter would grow up in a world where men like Jonathan Pierce couldn't abuse women with impunity, where financial power couldn't override basic human decency, where speaking the truth was more powerful than any amount of money or intimidation. Outside her window, the military-based community settled into evening routines of family dinners and homework help and bedtime stories. Normal life, Rebecca thought. The kind of normal that she'd forgotten was possible during her 2-year marriage to a man who'd systematically convinced her that chaos and control were the natural state of relationships. Her daughter kicked again, stronger now and more coordinated, as if she was practicing for the world she'd soon enter, a world where her mother had already fought the most important battle for her freedom and won. 8 months later, Rebecca stood behind the expanded counter of Henderson's Diner, officially reopened as Henderson's Community Kitchen and Support Center. The morning rush had just ended, leaving the familiar hum of conversation from the weekly support group meeting in the back room and the comfortable bustle of a small business that had evolved into something much more significant. The transformation of the diner mirrored Rebecca's own journey from victim to survivor to advocate. What had begun as Dorothy's simple intervention in a domestic violence situation had grown into a recognized community resource, with funding from the state domestic violence prevention program and partnerships with local law enforcement and healthcare providers. "Rebecca," called Marie Santos, the newest member of their support group, "could you come back here for a minute? I think Jennifer's ready to take the next step." Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron, an apron that read, "Henderson's Kitchen, where everyone deserves safe harbor," and headed toward the back room where 12 women of various ages and backgrounds sat around a large table that had been donated by a local furniture store owned by a domestic violence survivor. Jennifer Martinez was 26, 7 months pregnant, and had been attending meetings for 3 weeks without saying much beyond her first name. Today she looked different, determined rather than defeated, angry rather than afraid. "I want to file a police report," Jennifer said quietly, her hands protective over her belly, in a gesture Rebecca recognized all too well. "I want to get a restraining order. I want to leave him." The room filled with supportive murmurs from women who understood exactly what those words meant. Not just the practical steps of leaving an abuser, but the psychological courage required to believe that escape was possible and that life after abuse could be better than life during it. Rebecca sat down next to Jennifer, her own daughter sleeping peacefully in the carrier she wore during work hours. Little Hope Thompson, she'd legally changed their last names back to Thompson, was now 4 months old and represented everything Rebecca had fought for during those dark months of pregnancy and legal battles. "Jennifer," Rebecca said gently, "tell us what you need and we'll help you get it. That's what we're here for." The support group had grown from Dorothy's initial idea into a comprehensive program that included safety planning, legal referrals, financial counseling, job training, and childcare services. Rebecca coordinated the program, while Emma provided professional counseling, and Mac handled security concerns with the kind of tactical planning that kept everyone safe. "I need somewhere to stay," Jennifer said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I need help with legal stuff. I need to know that my baby will be safe. We have emergency housing partnerships," Rebecca said, consulting the resource guide she'd helped develop. Sarah Mitchell can handle the legal paperwork, and Mac can coordinate with police for safety planning. Most importantly, you need to know that you're not alone and that leaving is possible. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, not the helpless tears of victimization, but the empowering tears of someone who'd found hope after believing none existed. Rebecca recognized the expression because she'd worn it herself 8 months earlier in the same building. After the support group ended, Rebecca walked through the kitchen area where Mac was training a new volunteer cook, a former military medic who'd found purpose in providing both food and safety for domestic violence survivors. The synergy between Mac's protective instincts and his civilian service work had been therapeutic for his own transition issues while providing crucial security expertise for their program. "How's Jennifer doing?" Mac asked, noting Rebecca's thoughtful expression. "She's ready to leave," Rebecca replied. "Full safety plan, legal protection, housing arrangement. She reminds me of myself 8 months ago, scared but determined." Mac nodded with understanding. He'd watched Rebecca transform from the frightened woman in the diner booth to the confident advocate who now helped other women find their own strength. The change had been gradual but profound, driven by the discovery that helping others heal was often the most effective way to complete one's own healing process. Emma appeared from the office area carrying the kind of paperwork that kept nonprofit organizations running effectively. The community kitchen had received several grants for expansion, including a major funding award that would allow them to provide transitional housing services directly rather than just making referrals. "Good news and complicated news," Emma announced. "The State Domestic Violence Coalition wants to use our program as a model for rural community interventions." "That's the good news." "And the complicated news?" Rebecca asked. "They want you to testify at the state legislature about effective community-based prevention programs. It would mean publicity, recognition, possibly some unwanted attention from people who prefer that domestic violence remain invisible." Rebecca considered the opportunity while bouncing hope gently in her carrier. Public testimony would mean putting herself forward as an expert on domestic violence, using her own story to advocate for policy changes that could help thousands of women across the state. "Unwanted attention," she repeated thoughtfully. "You mean Jonathan?" The civil lawsuit had concluded 6 months earlier with a settlement that provided financial compensation to all 6 plaintiffs while avoiding a trial that would have been emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Jonathan's business empire had survived the IRS audit, but his reputation had been permanently damaged by the multiple allegations of financial abuse and coercive control. "Jonathan's been quiet since the settlement," Mac pointed out. "His lawyers made it clear that any further harassment would violate the terms of the agreement and open him up to additional criminal charges. Plus," Emma added with satisfaction, "word is that his board of directors has been discussing succession planning. Apparently, having a CEO whose personal life generates negative publicity isn't good for stock prices." The idea that Jonathan might finally face professional consequences for his personal behavior felt like justice in a way that money could never quite achieve. Rebecca had long since stopped caring about revenge, but accountability was different. Accountability meant preventing future victims. "I'll do it," Rebecca said quietly. "I'll testify. If sharing my story can help other women, then it's worth any risk." Dorothy emerged from the kitchen where she'd been preparing for the afternoon shift, her expression carrying the kind of pride that came from watching something good grow from a moment of moral courage. "Rebecca, honey," Dot said, "there's someone here to see you. Says she drove down from the state capitol after hearing about our program." The woman waiting in the main dining area looked familiar, though Rebecca couldn't immediately place her. She was in her 40s, well-dressed but not ostentatiously so, and carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested professional competence. "Rebecca Thompson?" the woman asked, standing as Rebecca approached. "I'm Catherine Walsh. I used to be Catherine Pierce. I wanted to thank you for what you've done." Rebecca's heart stopped as she realized she was looking at Jonathan's mother, but Catherine was different somehow, calmer, more centered, free of the nervous tension that had characterized her testimony during the custody hearings. "Catherine," Rebecca said carefully, "what are you doing here?" Catherine smiled, and for the first time, Rebecca could see past the years of stress and fear to the woman she might have been without 35 years of financial and emotional abuse. I'm here because I finally left Richard, Catherine said simply. The divorce was finalized last month, and I wanted you to know that watching you find your courage helped me find mine. The revelation that Catherine had left her own abusive marriage felt like the completion of a cycle that had started with Rebecca's escape from Jonathan. 3 generations of Pierce family abuse were being broken simultaneously. Rebecca protecting her daughter, Catherine finally escaping her husband, and Jonathan facing consequences that prevented him from easily finding new victims. Where are you living now? Rebecca asked. I bought a small house about an hour from here, Catherine replied. I'm volunteering with the literacy program at the community college, and I'm thinking about going back to school myself. Turns out there are a lot of things I wanted to do with my life that I'd forgotten about during all those years of just surviving. Hope chose that moment to wake up and begin fussing, and Catherine's expression softened as she looked at the baby girl who represented everything Rebecca had fought to protect. She's beautiful, Catherine said quietly. She's going to grow up knowing that her mother is a fighter, that some things are worth standing up for, no matter how difficult it gets. Rebecca adjusted Hope in her carrier, soothing her with the kind of natural maternal instinct that had developed over months of single parenting, with support but without the constant criticism and control that had characterized her pregnancy. Catherine, Rebecca said, would you like to stay for dinner? We serve community meals on Thursday nights, and I think you might enjoy meeting some of the other women who found their way here. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, the kind that came from unexpected kindness and the recognition that healing happened in community rather than isolation. I'd like that very much, Catherine said. As evening settled over Henderson's community kitchen, Rebecca looked around at the space that had been transformed from a simple diner into a beacon of hope for women who'd lost their way in abusive relationships. The booth where Jonathan had grabbed her wrist was still there, but now it was surrounded by resource posters, community announcements, and photos of success stories from women who'd found safety and rebuilt their lives. Mac was in the kitchen, working alongside volunteers who'd found purpose in providing both food and sanctuary. Emma was facilitating an informal counseling session with 3 women who were at different stages of leaving abusive relationships. Dorothy was coordinating with local law enforcement about safety protocols for a high-risk client, and Rebecca stood in the center of it all, holding her daughter who would grow up understanding that love meant support rather than control. That strength was measured by how you protected others rather than how you dominated them. That family was defined by who showed up when you needed them most. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Mitchell. Legislature confirmed your testimony date. You're going to change lives up there, Rebecca. You already have down here. Rebecca looked at the message and felt the same sense of rightness that had guided her decisions since that afternoon when Mac had stepped between her and Jonathan's anger. Some battles were worth fighting, some truths were worth telling, and some changes were worth the risk and effort required to make them happen. Some people think family is about blood, Rebecca said quietly to Hope, who was now sleeping peacefully against her mother's chest. But I learned it's about who shows up when you need them most. Outside, the parking lot was filled with cars belonging to women who'd found their way to Henderson's kitchen through word of mouth, referrals from healthcare providers, recommendations from law enforcement, or simply by recognizing the signs that had once described their own lives. Each car represented a story of survival, a decision to seek help, a choice to believe that something better was possible. Inside, Dorothy was already planning the next day's community meal. Mac was scheduling security training for other business owners who wanted to learn how to recognize and respond to domestic violence. And Emma was coordinating with the state coalition about expanding their program model to other rural communities. Rebecca Thompson had come full circle from victim to survivor to advocate, from isolation to community, from fear to hope. Her daughter would grow up in a world where women like her mother had fought to ensure that domestic violence was no longer a private shame, but a public responsibility, where businesses like Henderson's Kitchen provided not just food, but sanctuary, where families were defined not by legal documents, but by who stood up when someone needed protection. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Every day brought new women who needed to hear that escape was possible, that healing was achievable, that life after abuse could be not just survivable, but fulfilling. And every day Rebecca found new strength in the recognition that her own survival had meaning beyond her personal freedom. It had become a beacon for others still lost in the darkness of controlling relationships. As she locked up the community kitchen that night, Rebecca paused to read the small plaque that had been installed next to the front door. Henderson's Community Kitchen and Support Center, established in memory of all the women who didn't make it out and in celebration of all the women who did. Her daughter slept peacefully in her car seat, surrounded by the security of a community that understood that protecting children meant protecting their mothers, that preventing domestic violence required everyone to get involved, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons or money, but with courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserved to live free from fear. Rebecca drove home through streets that no longer held terror, to an apartment that belonged to her, to a life that she'd built through her own choices and the support of people who understood that family loyalty meant showing up when someone needed you most. The story that had begun with Jonathan's hand wrapped around her wrist in a diner booth had ended with her hand extended to other women who needed to know that escape was possible, that healing was achievable, and that the future could be different from the past. Some people thought family was about blood, but Rebecca had learned it was about who showed up when you needed them most. And when her daughter grew up, she would understand that her mother had been surrounded by family in all the ways that truly mattered.